what we're going to talk about tonight is Catholic slavery. And what is most problematic about this history is the fact that to historians, whether they're Latin Americanists or U.S. Americanists, this is essentially common knowledge. But for Catholics, not really common knowledge, right? Especially for Catholic theologians, and that's a problem, right? When Catholic theologians whose job it is to talk about theology and those issues that matter the most to Catholics aren't familiar with this legacy, right? And in fact, in some cases, try to avoid this legacy. It's not good for marketing, right? And we all know how important marketing is, right? Because we Catholics are the good guys. So, we're going to cover three things in this talk. First, the extent of Catholic slavery in the Americas, which is for the most part, common knowledge to historians, right? The historians know this stuff, that this is, something that you would cover if you're a graduate student, in your first year seminar on historiography. That this is not something that is hidden away, right? This is pretty much well known. Right? And second, what Catholic theologians at the time said about slavery, and you'll find that it's highly problematic and a little bit disturbing. And third, why I think mainstream Catholic theologians, why they have shied away from this topic. So for those of you who don't know, slavery, African slavery, or the use of African slaves by the Catholic empires was very common, right? So when I talk about Catholic empires in the Americas, I'm talking about Spanish, Portuguese, and French. And the sort of slavery that the church participated in was all types of slavery, whether it's sort of having domestic servants, using artisans, having slaves work in their textile mills, right? Having slaves work in their haciendas. That was a common practice. Right? Secular priests, right? Those priests who did not belong to a religious order owned slaves. The religious, of course, the religious orders like the Society of Jesus, the Augustinians, the Dominicans owned slaves. They owned quite a bit. We're talking about in the hundreds in urban centers like Mexico City and Puebla and Manila, right? And of course, lay people. Now, all this would have been in keeping with the various papal bulls from the 15th century that essentially authorized the use of African slaves or the capture of African slaves in perpetuity, right? So for the most part, nobody is doing anything that is contrary to Catholic doctrine at the time. And also too, before I move on, there's a bit of a footnote that I have to throw in here, that when we're talking about slavery, that we can't forget Native Americans, right? That after 1537, Native Americans are essentially split into two camps in the Americas and in the Philippines. Filipinos would have been considered to be Indios, or just like Native Americans, at least in terms of the racial scheme of the Spanish Empire. You would have Indians of reason, those Indians that could be converted to Catholicism, and Indios barbaros, those Indios who, for whatever reason, were perceived as being barbarians. So the Apaches, the Comanches, the Yaquis would have been considered barbarian Indians and therefore subject to enslavement, right? So even though in some areas you'll see, or in some historical texts, they'll say, well, the Native Americans weren't allowed to be enslaved. That's partially true, right? But not only does slavery help fund the growth of the church in general for settlers in the Americas, but also it helps to fund the missionary church, right? That aspect of the church, or the church militant, that is focused on converting Native Americans to Catholicism, right? So the very thing that many Catholics today, if you go to places like Boston College, you have these great portraits of Jesuits looking on a boat nobly being paddled by Native Americans, that that this didn't happen by accident, that there was a lot of money involved in this process, and that money had to come from somewhere in terms of the creation or the establishment of the mission system, right? So even if we looked specifically at the establishment of missions for Native Americans, that you'd have to look at where that money is coming from, right? And that money is coming from the slave trade. And the Jesuits, by the time of their suppression in 1767, actually are the best at it, right? They are really good at being slave owners. They are really good at trading slaves, breaking up families, having them work in textile mills or sweatshops, having them work on their haciendas, and then using those funds to further their missionary project, right? And so, when we're thinking about global Catholicism, right, and this is something that we Catholics today pride ourselves in. Oh, we have this global Catholicism, that we're a global church, but it came from empire, right? And it came from a particularly nasty type of empire. Right. So, we should kind of pay attention to this stuff. So what Catholic theologians said about slavery at the time, right? So even people like, Bartolome de las Casas, this protector of the Indios, early in his career as advocate on behalf of Native Americans, who, by the way, nobody asked him to be, especially not Native Americans, right? Actually called for the use of, or the importation of, African slaves so that Native Americans would no longer be stuck in the encomienda system. 1675, Life of Martin de Porres, who is a part of the convent of Our Lady of Rosary, and who is attempting to bring notice to the life of Martin de Porres, through his sacred biography, has no problem with slavery. That slavery, this is a part of the process, and how else are we going to fund our missionary project to the Chinese or to Filipinos? Even Alonso de Sandoval, who wrote Instituting the Salvation of Ethiopians, would say that, look, this is in keeping with natural law and therefore not problematic. So these, for the most part, are texts or are works that have the official blessing of the church, literally the imprimatur, right? The imprimatur, right? That said, look, this is what we agree with. My scholarship, for the most part, all of my projects are interested not only with the sort of official view, obviously that's important, right? This is the stuff that most people see. My projects are interested in latent theology, right? Those theologies that are kind of behind the scenes. So, not what the high school teacher is saying to his or her students, but what the high school teacher is saying to other high school students in the faculty lounge. Right? And so in this latent theology, we have theologians of the same time, right? We have ranking members of the Society of Jesus, ranking members of the Order of Preachers, who are writing letters to each other, not necessarily for public consumption or for outsiders, but to one another as colleagues. And they're writing things like, well, the African is closely linked to the devil. That in fact, the African's body looks a lot like the devil. And when you do see the devil, it's because, some sort of African is involved with this, right? And remember, these people have, coming from the sort of imperial context, they have a notion of blood purity, right? That they believe that one's blood determines one's spiritual predisposition, right? So you have all this official stuff, which, by the way, isn't all that nice. And then you have this unofficial stuff being said by these ranking members of the church. And for the most part, nobody calls them on it. Nobody says, hey, this is a problematic statement. Well, because they all believe it, right? That this is a part and parcel of the program. Andres Perez de Ribas of northwestern Mexico, again, a ranking Jesuit. Throughout his histories, black demons are everywhere, right? That black demons are trying to destroy African/demons are trying to destroy their missionary project, and they are fighting against that. Jose de Arriaga of Peru, who was a ranking Jesuit there, would say very similar things about the Andes, right? So this is something that was very much a part of their culture, a part of who they are, at least professionally. Why does that legacy matter? Well, the legacy matters because whether we like it or not, this is Catholic theology. So if we're going to take credit for the good stuff that we Catholics produce, we have to take credit for the bad stuff, right? And I think that we as Catholics do have a habit, the institutional habit, of ignoring all the bad stuff, right? Even though it is very much a part of the history, and even though there are still ways in which we benefit from that not so great legacy. And for the most part, there's nothing wrong with confronting it. So why have modern mainstream Catholic theologians not engaged with this particular discourse in a meaningful way? Especially since most of this information, again, is common knowledge. And I'm going to come back to this over and over again. The fact that this is common knowledge for historians, that there's really no reason or excuse for not knowing this information if you are, one, a Catholic and you have a college education, or two, especially if you're a theologian, somebody who is fighting the good fight on behalf of the church. Right? Again, common information. You can, pick up any, go to any major library. I just was down at the Barnes & Noble here, the Yale bookstore, and at the very front, they have one of the great works of Professor Brian Davis, right? His work, The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture, in 1966, right? And won the Pulitzer in 1967. I mean, it talks about these issues, right? So, the time has passed where we can say, oh, well, we didn't know. Right, that this is hidden information. It's not hidden information, not in archives or anything like that. That other scholars have done the work, and scholars who have done this work aren't necessarily anti-Catholic, right? So this is not a Protestant scheme to bring down the church. That this is sort of a good scholarship being done, right, coming from strong or reputable institutions.